Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Ramsay Centre's Distinguished Speaker Series for 2021. I'm Simon Haines. Our topic today is the sensible centre. Can it hold? And if it can't, are some of our freedoms at risk? And we're very fortunate to have as our guest today, in fact, one of the best known faces and voices in the Australian media landscape. And he is Chris Uhlmann, who's currently, as most of you would know, the political editor for Nine News, where he's been for 4 years or so. And before that, Chris, as most of you would also know, spent many years with the ABC in a range of roles, from hosting Canberra's top-rating breakfast show, 666. And by the way, Chris, I used to listen to you every morning back there in the early 2000s, driving the kids to school. So he did that, but then he was on flagship national programs as the political editor for ABC News and the 7:30 Report and Insiders, was the presenter of AM. Chris has been an outspoken critic of media behaviour more than once in a refreshingly non-partisan kind of way. He also, I can disclose, if you didn't know this, once ran for political office in Canberra many years ago, I believe, and of course is married to a long-serving ALP federal member for Canberra. Chris won a Walkley Award for broadcast interviewing in 2008, and he was part of the Four Corners team that won the Golden Quill Award a few years back for an investigation into China's power and influence in Australia, which turns out to have been a very prescient and topical thing to do, and is fascinating to me as a long-term resident of Hong Kong as well. In earlier lives, Chris was everything from a seminarian to a security guard, and also a novelist, which maybe not everybody knows. He co-authored 3 works of political fiction, 2 of which were adapted later into a television miniseries called Secret City. So Chris Uhlmann, a man of many talents, warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Simon. It's very
Great to have you with us. So you are a somewhat unique presence in Australian media, Chris, and I'm keen to get you to share your thoughts with us, particularly on the media itself, a little bit later on. But before that, I thought we might start on the wider national political picture that you've observed in your years in these leading roles in the bubble and outside. And I thought we might look at this in 3 areas. First of all, the topic that you cannot avoid talking about right now, which is COVID and media and political responses, leadership responses to COVID. The second, whether there are more general conclusions that we can draw about leadership at the national and state level. And then third, get you to open up a bit for us about the media and what you see as the role of the media in all of this. So Chris Uhlmann, starting with the COVID, and let me just open by putting a kind of a phrase that'll mean a lot to you as a former seminarian. Play advocatus diaboli in this conversation for a minute, or you might just say it's a bit of a middle of the road position, really. So couldn't we say that our leaders haven't handled this too badly, really? I mean, we have one of the lowest rates of infection and death from COVID in the whole world. We've got one of the best, if not the best, economic outcome from these 2 years of lockdown or semi-lockdown. Vaccine rates after a very slow kickoff are beginning to get there. And after all, this was a completely unprecedented mega world event. Does it seem a bit unfair to do what some people tend to do and bag our leaders when, we've kind of muddled through somewhat better than most, helped as ever by our unique geography? So how about that as a kick-off position? Would you go along with that?
Well, Simon, I think there's a lot of truth in that. Obviously, Australia did, at the outset of this disease, leverage what it's always done, and that's its borders and its isolation from the rest of the world. And that was a sensible thing to do because at the outset, we didn't know what kind of threat we really faced. This was a novel disease. We didn't know then how badly it might spread through the entire population. As we got a little bit more of a grip on it, it was pretty obvious that it was affecting mostly elderly people, although people with underlying conditions did get affected by it, and that the young pretty much, although it's, in any large-scale pandemic or an epidemic, you are going to have all parts of the population are being affected. But if you look at the Spanish flu, for example, that killed disproportionately young people. Some 50 million people, we think, died around the world, 15,000 in Australia. And remarkably, they were the young. Now, faced with that kind of disease, I think that's a very different threat than the one that we saw now circulating around the world. Obviously, there are different variants, and who knows where it might end. So you're right. On one level, I think the first response of the Australian governments was the right one, which was to shut your borders, have a look and see, shut things down, try and kill off the disease as best you can, and then work out what the adversary was. But then after that, I think that you have to take into account what the cure that was imposed on the community was compared with the threat from the disease. And the cure was at least as bad as the disease across a range of fronts. And that is that in order to stop the disease from spreading, obviously there is one way that does work. We know that it spread through people if you isolate people from each other. In fact, if you put every person in solitary confinement for a couple of weeks, you would absolutely kill off this disease. You'd also kill off your society. So while it made sense in the early stages to lock us down, I think that over time, the damage that has been done to our society, to our community, to our economy, to the livelihoods of lots of people who can't afford to live and work from home, particularly the poor, and especially for our young in the loss of education that they've suffered. I think the continued recourse to wrenching lockdowns has had an effect on this community and the loss of civil liberties that we will live with long after we've stopped counting deaths from COVID-19. So it is the two things. What was the health cost of the disease, the likely health cost, and what is the health, social and economic cost of the lockdowns that we see still continuing in our two major cities? Long after much of the rest of the world, which we thought was failing, is beginning to come out of this and starting to live life pretty much as usual.
That's very interesting, Chris. And I think two of the things you've mentioned, namely the reactions of young people, almost a generational split, and the other thing is the impact on if you can put it this way, a certain class of the population is something that we should return to later in the conversation, because this has been an outstandingly worrying feature of the whole thing, I would say. So looking at the TV news every evening, right, which some of us have got sick of doing, but if you do that, you're very conscious of, on the one hand, there's the political leader, and then standing either right at their shoulder or they are standing at this person's shoulder, there is the senior medical officer, the expert advice. And can you give us your thoughts on how much of a, don't know how to put this, how much of a kind of transparency, a gap there is between what the medical people are saying and what the politicians are deciding? Because you get the impression, maybe more in Victoria, other states, but that decisions have been outsourced. The decision-making process has been outsourced. Politicians are wrapping themselves up in mantras about not one person must die unnecessarily, which is more what a medical officer would say than you'd expect a politician maybe to say. They play to mass psychology. Do you think that visual image of the premier or the leader playing second fiddle to the medical advice, is that part of what you mean when you say there's something that's going to stay with us?
Oh, look, absolutely. What we've seen through the course of this pandemic is this shift, this recourse to expertise, if you like, and the chief medical officer or the chief health officer, if you're talking about the states, becomes the person to which all questions are put, in fact, and to which authority is transferred. And to me, that's been a massive mistake. And for two reasons that it's been done. One is cowardice, because the politicians do not want to take the blame for anything that might go wrong. It's better to have the expert hovering at your shoulder. They gave me this advice and therefore I followed it. Should the bad thing then follow? Well, that's really something that you're going to have to take up with the experts. And let's face it, expert advice comes in many different shapes and forms, and you can get 10 experts in a room and get 20 different opinions. So, expert advice should be listened to. Absolutely should be heeded. It should be weighed and leveled against everything else. But what we pay our politicians for is to make difficult decisions and to balance risk, and that's what we haven't seen through the course of this pandemic. So outsourcing of those decisions, I think, has been a very, very bad thing. And, you've seen on occasions too that these chief health officers have been blamed for the bad decision. The recent decision in Queensland for the 100 NRL wives and families, family members to come across the border, the Premier there blamed that decision on the chief health officer. Well, in the end, that's a political decision that's been made, and clearly there's been political discussions involved in it, because other people have been stopped from coming across the borders. In fact, it happened at the same time that Queenslanders were told they could not come home because, quote, hotel quarantine was full. So I think that, transferring power to medical authorities as the philosopher kings to run the country has been a mistake by politicians. One of the lines that the opposition leaders used a lot when he's been asked a question about this is, "I haven't got doctor in front of my name." No, he hasn't. He has got MP after his name. And what exactly is that supposed to mean? So I think that has done a lot of damage, and it's time that the political leadership in the country took back control of the running of the country, said that they're in charge, say that they're taking advice, and that what's delivered by experts is not wholly written. I'll finish on this, but the Doherty Institute modelling, and that's what it is. It's expert modelling. It's one set of expert modelling that we're relying on. You would think that it came down from Sinai if you were to listen to the way that journalists ask politicians about what do these words actually mean. And like the Bible, there are many different interpretations.
Yes, well, that's fascinating, Chris. I think you've written about this before. It's as if there's a failure at that level of the political leadership to explain how complicated the decision-making process is. It's always made to sound very simple, and as if there's only one kind of expert that we should really be listening to. So as you say, Platonic guardians, but they're all the same kind of guardian. So there doesn't seem to have been much effort to explain risk, or what risk is. I think you've written about iatrogenic risk, which is the risk that everybody has of dying in hospital, which is much greater than the risk of dying from COVID. Go on, please.
I know, Simon, but this came up during the AstraZeneca debate. And again, it struck me as utterly ludicrous that we're in the middle of the pandemic, and if you go back to the beginning of it, we didn't know whether or not you could get a vaccine for this kind of virus, because we didn't have one up until that point, even though people have been trying very hard. Turns out when you put the best minds of the world to this, you can come up with a number of different vaccines. The one that the Australian government plugged for was one that could be manufactured here. That made an enormous amount of sense, because we're at the arse end of the world, on the end of the supply chain. You want to make sure that you've got something that is manufactured here. It turns out to be AstraZeneca. It is a kind of technology that's well known to us. That's why we could make it here. It turns out that you've got a 1 in a million chance of dying from a rare blood clot because of that. Because there are other vaccines that are new, that are on the marketplace, the mRNA vaccines, which we didn't have adequate supply of. And of course, some blame does fall to the federal government for not securing that supply. It was as if we were in a supermarket for vaccines, that we could pick and choose the best vaccines available when we should be using the one that was available to us. And at one stage, I just looked at the different levels of risks that we already take in every other walk of life, be it driving cars or walking or going to see your doctor. Now, if you're going to take on the balance of risk what you should or shouldn't be doing, well, one of the things you wouldn't go and do is see your doctor, because about 14,000 people a year die at the hands of their doctors and nurses through medical mistakes. Now, we don't say to people, stop going to hospital, which is a very dangerous place, by the way, because you might suffer a bad consequence because of it. So we've got the entire risk profile of this disease completely out of skew, and it's still that way. COVID-19 is not just the only disease in Australia that no one is allowed to die from. It's the only disease that you're not allowed to catch. And it's just remarkable when, that we go through this daily count every day of case numbers. Happily, we're beginning to change the conversation at the moment. We should be talking about hospitalisations and deaths. And by the way, and this may come across as harsh, but some of the slogans that we've seen throughout the course of this campaign, one of them is, every death is a tragedy. That is not true. That is simply not true. And one of the things I think the West has to cope with, and this is something for your centre, is that we now have completely lost touch with death being part of life. And that if you live a long and healthy life and you get into your 80s and 90s, by the way, something when we were born, Simon, that life expectancy wasn't that long, just that little time ago. We've elongated people's lives. Some of them are spending the last few years of their lives in pain and misery, wanting to die. So the death of anyone who's young is a tragedy. The death of someone in their 80s and 90s is a great deal of regret for the family. But if they've lived a good life, then, that is life.
Yes, well, and again, in this day and age, it sounds harsh, but I do remember my grandmother used to say to me that her phrase was "flu is the old man's friend." So that was a tough generation,
He'd be
but
locked
that
up
was
these days. Someone should have
well,
put him in
you wouldn't be
jail or
allowed to
something
say.
like that.
So, but I mean, on the one hand, it's completely understandable that we want to protect our hospital system from overload. I mean, nobody wants scenes like we saw graphically on the television last year of, people ill in the streets in those early Italian outbreaks, or what we've seen in Indonesia and India. Of course, that's terrible. But as you've said, it's a completely different thing to reduce the risk of anybody catching COVID to nil. I mean, that just isn't going to happen. As you've said, it's a pandemic. Sorry, it's an endemic, not a pandemic. And what are your thoughts on this? Hardly anybody in the media talks about Sweden anymore. Now that's an interesting story in itself, or about, say, the comparisons in caseloads and death rates, impact on hospitals between Florida and California, two very similar US states in terms of their size, ranked very close together in terms of death rates and caseloads. But one has had a lockdown almost for 2 years, and the other one almost hasn't had one. Why doesn't this get more? Why doesn't this get more coverage?
No, and I think that, it was I heard someone saying in Washington right at the beginning of this pandemic that you could walk onto the streets of Washington and tell in a non-trivial way what someone's politics were by whether or not they were wearing a mask. And interestingly, and again, it is something now for PhD students to start to consider over the course of the next 10, 20, 30 years. There are an enormous amount of political overlay that ended up in this pandemic. And now I'm sure you are on the same page. We are not making light of this disease. No novel disease should be made light of by any human population. Throughout the course of human history, plague has been one of those things that we have been terrified of, and for good reason, because every now and then one comes along that is really serious and takes out 1/3 of the population. So there's every good reason to be concerned about it. But there have been a whole lot of overlays with this as well and different communities have dealt with them in different ways. One of the things I found really irritating about listening to the Premier of Victoria talking about what was happening in Victoria was there is no other way. So if there is COVID, then there must be lockdown. If there is one case, then we must go immediately. Well, of course there is another way. Right around the world, we've seen a whole lot of different ways of approaching this. Now, you can say there are better ways and worse ways. Daniel Andrews can argue that his way is a much better way than the rest of the world. And they could say that in Sweden there were over 14,000 deaths. And when you looked at Denmark and countries that were similar, they had fewer deaths. Now, there was a problem in Sweden. The same problem we saw in Victoria was you had to keep this disease out of aged care homes, because once it got in there, that certainly was a place where people would die in their droves. I think that the argument early on, once we knew that, was if you're going to lock anyone up, you'd lock down the aged care homes, wouldn't you? That would be the way that you would proceed. You'd lock down those people who are most at risk, and maybe they should spend 2 years isolating from society. But you wouldn't lock down the entire society for one section of it. So all through this, yes, there've been different ways of managing it. And again, we're seeing now there's a problem now in Florida because they haven't been as highly vaccinated as other parts of the country. In the end, the vaccine is one of the ways out of this. My big fear in the long run, though, Simon, is we have given up an enormous amount of liberty along the way. I see in the Atlantic someone recently asking whether or not Australia is a liberal democracy anymore. If the country can ban you from leaving the country and call itself a liberal democracy, if you're having curfews on the streets of Melbourne and in Sydney, things we didn't do during the Second World War, we're now rolling out against our citizenry. And interestingly enough, the Australian people are accepting it. So it's still now, by the way, I'd say that the premiers have been toughest, are still doing very well in the polls. And we've seen so far in all the state elections that the premiers have been well rewarded for being risk averse. So perhaps that's what the people want.
Absolutely. The public seems only too ready to play along, at least until recently. And we'll get in a bit later, I hope, to what seems to be emerging as a kind of generational difference between how prepared people are to play along. Older ones more prepared, younger ones less so. But we'll get to that a bit later. And I did just want to say, as a coda to what you were saying about really bad plagues, in the 1590s, when Shakespeare was writing his early plays, there was one year when 1/3 of all Londoners died. And he was busy writing The Merchant of Venice or whatever, and doesn't mention it. Doesn't even mention it. So it's times change. So Chris, if we can move perhaps now to the level of the question of political leadership in general in the country, because I know you've been in a pretty unique position to observe this both at federal and state levels during your career. So as we were saying at the beginning, some might say that the pandemic has tested leaders all over the world and ours haven't done too badly. But would you say that on a more general level, we've kind of exposed a weaker generation of leaders than maybe we had a little while in the past when you and I were a bit younger? Would the giants of the past have displayed the same kind of tendencies to palm off governance to somebody else as the current generation are doing? I mean, I'm thinking obviously of the Hawke, Keating, Howard years that in retrospect, it seems like a kind of golden age, a quarter of a century back then in Australian leadership. You know, and just before that began, that era, I remember Donald Horne's book. He talks about we're a lucky country run by second-rate people. But for those 25 years, I don't think we were run by second-rate people. The question is, are we now? I mean, what does the gallery think? How does it look from your perspective about what we've witnessed, not just in the COVID era, but during the last 10, 12 years, about this kind of quality of leadership issue, both at federal and at state level?
Yeah, well, of course, what we've seen over the course of the last decade or more now, it seems to have gone remarkably swiftly, is the change of political leadership at a state and federal level, which has been rapidly driven by polls and by fears among those on the backbench that they might lose their seat. I mean, don't forget, it's not that long ago that we were going through prime ministers like there was no tomorrow. You know, the Rudd, Gillard, Abbott, Turnbull era. It was just a remarkable time of disruption in Australian politics. And the thing that was remarkable then, I know when I travelled overseas, people would say to me, like, what is the problem in Australia? Like, economically, you're doing good. There's no real reason that we could see why you'd be churning through prime ministers in this way. And it was something that was really difficult to explain to anyone who was outside of Australia. And I've got to say, on occasions, I'm still coming to terms with it myself. With the Hawkes and the Howards and the Keatings have given up their leadership to a group of unknown chief medical officers. I like to think not, but then again, they were not tested in this way. So this hasn't really happened in Australia for 100 years, and we know what happened 100 years ago because then we closed our borders against each other and acted like 6 colonies and 2 territories that are masquerading as a federation. And not much, I think, has changed in that time. So you could make the argument that we're acting now the way that we acted then, and maybe we've never really grown up. Maybe we've never really grown into our federation. We are getting a lesson in federation. I think that we never really understood quite how powerful the states were. The states now, knowing their power, will continue to use that. The only power that the Commonwealth essentially has is the power of the bully pulpit, which is not much, and the power of the purse, which used to be a lot. But now what we're finding is premiers are simply making announcements and saying, well, of course, if the Prime Minister doesn't want to go 50-50 on this particular piece of money that we want to spend, well, then he clearly cares more about New South Wales than Victoria, or more about South Australia than Queensland. So it's hard to resist when we get into that kind of politics. So I think we're in a pretty dire place at the moment. Look, I know these people, some of them, and know some of them quite well. They're good people, right? They are good people who are trying their best in very trying circumstances. I would say this, that they made a huge mistake in outsourcing their responsibilities to others. They should pick that up again now and show some leadership and stop being as risk averse as they are. Look, there is no way out of this without some people dying. That's what they need to tell the Australian public. That is not the desired outcome. They didn't want the disease, they've got the disease. This disease does kill some people. We're trying to minimise that number while we minimise the distress that we cause the rest of the community. And that should be the balancing act that we're striking. And particularly, we should favour the young. All communities, this is the thing that gets me, we have reversed the polarity on what human communities usually do. Usually, and they can be quite brutal about it, human communities will leave the old and the sick behind in the past in order to protect the young and the healthy, because that's how tribes prosper. What we've decided to do is we will protect those who are most frail in the community at the extraordinary disadvantage of those who are the youngest. And what's happened to people's education, I think, will be something that we'll live with for a long time.
With education and also with mental health. It seems that the damage being done, particularly, it's falling very heavily on younger people. The damage to mental health from these long periods of isolation is likely to be lasting, and that's again not something that's weighed up as part of the overall risk of this approach.
And I'm sure you know them. I know family members who are suffering extremely badly because of these lockdowns, particularly the lockdowns in Victoria, where that community now is just mentally exhausted. I think what's been most remarkable is that they put up with this for such a long time. I do not agree with people who go onto the streets who are anti-vaxxers or, anti-lockdowns at the time and cause violence. However, I think that if this was to continue, if we were to continue with these levels of restrictions for too much longer, we will see mass civil disobedience. People will simply begin to disregard some of the more ludicrous things that are being asked of them, and particularly at the high levels of vaccination rates. In the end, we do have to learn how to live with this disease, and that means that we have to accept risk for ourselves, weigh the risks for our family, get ourselves vaccinated, try and get as many people in the community vaccinated as possible. But for those who choose not to be vaccinated, or those for whom vaccination simply isn't going to be enough of protection, there was nothing we could do to defend them.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, there are obviously some pretty strange characters out there in the conspiracy theory, anti-vax, QAnon kind of world who are harming us all by persuading others who are more gullible or more ignorant not to get vaccinated. But there is a lot more than that going on in these protests, particularly amongst younger people, wouldn't you say? I mean, when large crowds gather to protest, it's the loss of their livelihoods that many of them are talking about. What they perceive as elites, like you and me, in a way. I mean, people with large guaranteed salaries, whether they're taxpayer funded or corporate funded, making decisions that don't hurt themselves, but do put small business owners, shop owners, self-employed people, non-essential trades, putting them out of work. Massive increase in inequality, right? And in effect, the creation of a new disadvantaged class, an excluded class, which, if you were Hillary Clinton, you'd dismiss them as deplorables for going out in the streets and protesting like that. But isn't that, I mean, would it be a stretch to say is that this is the core of a new, aggrieved, disaffected class of Australians?
Oh, I think that absolutely it is. And I think we're seeing it at the moment, and it has been happening for a while now, where the allegiances of those that you would have called the working class have shifted. And they've shifted from the Labor Party more to the coalition. The Prime Minister is quite clear about where he's going to be running his next election campaign. He talks about the coalition being the party of the regions and the suburbs, not the inner city. And it's not that he wouldn't try in those areas, but certainly where he imagines he will make ground is in the regions and the suburbs. In Queensland, they're talking about the blue collar workers. This was once the area that the Labor Party thrived in, but now it is thriving in those parts of the world where the highly educated elites, and that's what they are coalescing. They are the people who are now driving the left, if you like, of the political agenda. And there is a massive divide opening up. And I think that you'll find that the working class, let's call them that, or the suburban class of people in Australia, the regional class of people in Australia, think that that group of people in the inner cities who are extraordinarily privileged, who have the access to this fast internet that's needed, with a large house that you can have your children spread out in and homeschool, rather than being huddled around a kitchen table with one computer if you're lucky and a bad internet connection, and your husband and wife or whoever's in the household at home and unable to work because they can't work from home, surviving on government welfare. Why wouldn't those people be angry? why wouldn't they look at those people who are essentially ordering their lives and think that they're not thinking about the way that I have to live my life and have no understanding of it? Look, I keep thinking back to when I was a security guard in the western suburbs of Sydney, and for a brief period, I never considered myself to be poor because, I could always have gone back to my mother and father, right? But I decided I wanted to make my way on my own. And I lived in a 2-bedroom flat with a guy who was a depressive who stopped working and didn't pay the rent. And for a while, we couldn't afford a fridge in the summer in Sydney. And if we'd been locked in that house together, 2 of us wouldn't have walked out. One would have killed the other if we'd been there for 6 or 8 weeks. And we certainly wouldn't have had, both of us would have lost our jobs. That's the reality that people who don't live in those sort of more privileged parts of the country are dealing with. And so I've found it enormously irritating to listen to people who have publicly funded jobs talking about how they're working merrily from home and how angry they are at these other people who just won't abide by the rules, because those rules are strangling them while they're liberating some others. I'm pretty sure that some people in public service jobs who have yet to return to the workplace after a year and a half have actually had lives that have been vastly improved by this disease, whereas others have suffered extraordinarily from it. That suffering disproportionately among the poor. So I'm not surprised people are angry. What surprises me is that there haven't been so far more violent protests, but I wouldn't rule it out.
Yeah, that's worrying and fascinating, Chris. And I guess one direction one could go with this is to think about the comparison between how the Democrats behaved in the United States around Trump and how the Labor Party might think about its own role going forward in Australia. I mean, the kind of class divide that we're talking about opening up in this country. What should Labor be doing about reaching out to those people that feel it has abandoned them? I mean, we had the phenomenon in the United States of the Democrats basically being sent into a hysterical frenzy by the sheer existence of Donald Trump, admittedly a pretty unpleasant person and in some ways a very bad president, many ways. But at the same time, the focus was on how awful Trump was, not on how do we reach out to those people who voted for him. And why did they do that? And what should we be doing? I mean, does the same problem present itself in this country in obviously less extreme way? There is no Trump. But what would you say to that?
I think they should begin to understand the people that brought them to the dance in the first place, and that's the working class of Australia. I think the Labor Party is perfectly placed to position itself to be the party that leads out of this pandemic, because there are a whole lot of questions that have been asked that an old style Labor Party can answer, which is that we've had an enormous shock. The threats that we've seen show our isolation, show that there are certain things that need to be made in Australia by Australians. You think that there's a working class party mantra right there, that we need to be able to ensure that we have the kinds of medical supplies that are necessary, that should there ever be a shock like this again, we don't have to search the rest of the world for the expertise to find them. And really to embrace the idea that there is a place for government. I think that where we are at the moment is ridiculously overweening and authoritarian, but there is a place for large government in the future, which we see, particularly when we're coming up against an authoritarian regime in China, which will leave COVID in the shade, by the way, in terms of threats that we face into the future. But it's embracing their working class past. My father was a member of the Labor Party. My wife was a member of the Labor Party and an MP. I certainly have some understanding of people from the Labor Party, because that was the background that I grew up in. But Chifley and Curtin would not recognise these people, and that these people would ban Chifley's pipe and banish him to the outhouse in terms of the views that he had about the world. They have to begin to understand that the intellectual elites of the inner city, and it is deeply left-leaning, are not the dispositions of the people who are going to elect them into government. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with those people's dispositions, by the way. Their worldview may well be more in touch with reality than people now who are finding ever more esoteric things to complain about, and fracturing our society ever more into different ideological groups based around identity. That is deeply damaging. And if the Labor Party disappears down that rat hole, then it will find itself very difficult to be elected.
to be re-elected. Yes, that's interesting. Well, one thing I'd like to ask you before we move on to the role of the media in all of this, and more generally, Chris, is I'm sure you've observed, as I have during our lifetimes, that many politicians, in fact, most politicians nowadays at federal and state level, seem to go straight from some kind of staffer, political staffer role or a party role into a safe seat. So our political class, I mean, you mentioned Curtin and Chifley, our political class no longer seems to represent the wider cross section of Australian employment and communities anymore. What do you think about this? Could this be part of the problem that we're seeing, where those making the decisions simply don't know what it's like to be the small business shopkeeper, blue collar person who's worst affected by the decisions? This is, in a sense, the Canberra bubble with a vengeance, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely, and there is some truth in that. I don't think it's just a Canberra bubble. It's a bubble that surrounds those people who've grown up in a pretty well-off existence and had access to a very good education and are able to reap all the benefits that an international society has to offer, against those that aren't offered those kinds of opportunities. And so that's where the great divide opens up, and I think it's a real danger for the Labor. The great strength of the Labor Party was it was connected directly to those people. In the past, when you came out of the trade union, you worked on the shop floor, you had some sort of skill. If you were representing electricians, you were an electrician. If you're a plumber, you were a plumber. It was not, remember, before we became the super unions, they were trade unions. They were for the people of the working class. As in the words of Kim Beazley, my party used to represent the cream of the working class, and now it's the dross, the dregs of the middle class. That was back in the 1960s and 70s. He was making that observation. So there was a transition, and it happened around about the Whitlam era, where the Labor Party started to change. And it changed quite dramatically through the leadership and the great Labor leaders, intellectual leadership from the Whitlams and the Don Dunstans of the world. And the Labor Party started to change its character. It's been over a long period of time. It still has the capacity and still has the people to be able to understand and to make that connection with, I'm not going to call them real people, because all people are real people, but with that experience of the world, And again, I keep going back to the sort of 8 or 9 years when I was sort of between jobs constantly, when we were in the 1980s, where we had not one but two recessions. I emerged from a Catholic seminary into a recession, and found that my associate diploma in religious studies didn't actually get me anything when I was looking for a job. So I became a storeman and packer in a bookshop. And then, at the end of the 1980s, again looking for work. But, it had the experiences of having to commute across Sydney, which was a ridiculous experience back then, going from Mount Druitt in the western suburbs of Sydney all the way to Artarmon in the traffic. Take me an hour and a half in each direction on a good day, and I was driving into the sun on the way there and into the sun on the way home. So the cost of petrol becomes an enormous thing. That it's one of the things that you think about. My car became an enormously important thing. When it broke down, the trains connections really didn't work to get me to work, and it was I learned a bit of mechanics just in trying to keep this old thing going, so that I could get to and from work. The whole experience of life was about making ends meet, and the small things that would make really big differences. When your car broke down or when Rego came around, it was really hard. So, you need to be able to have those experiences, or at least know that people have those experiences, to understand that they're not selfish when they're just thinking about themselves and their family. But the way that some talk now, you think about the sort of, the coal miner, all of those professions that we want to see gone, and which will go over time. There's no sympathy at all for their work styles among the inner urban elite. So I still think now, I certainly think now that the people in the inner cities have become so disconnected from their sources of wealth and from their sources of food and from their sources of energy, that they're constantly voting against them.
I can almost hear a future leader of the Labor Party speaking.
I as you said, I had one failed tilt at politics, which is a much longer story and more tragic than you can imagine in terms of how small a tragedy it was. But
No, but
no,
you speak very eloquently about this. So I'd like to turn from what might have been your career to more to what has been your career, and that's really to do with the media and how you see the role of the media, both in the last couple of years and more generally in our times. Such that the fourth estate, such an important cornerstone of our democracy, indispensable cornerstone. And I say this as a long-term resident of Hong Kong, watching how the first target that Beijing had in its move on Hong Kong was the South China Morning Post, Jimmy Lai's Apple Daily. This began before the recent awful events back at the time of the Umbrella Revolution. So you can see from that just how important all authoritarian governments regard it as being to control the press. So can I just ask you, Chris, what changes have you observed over your many years in the gallery in Canberra? How shall I put this, in the kind of level of thoughtfulness of the media class? I mean, have we moved away from having a genuine professional fact-based rather than opinion-based, non-partisan, kind of middle of the road press and media class?
Yeah, I think the thing to remember is that the media has been gutted in the time that I've been in it. So I arrived at the Canberra Times in 1989 as a 29-year-old copy boy. The thing I remember at the time was that the news editor was 29. So I thought I had such a long way to go to catch up to those people who had such a head start on me. But back then, we had a health reporter. We had someone who reported on the local ACT Trades Hall. There was a city reporter. There was someone there were two people who did the early years of the ACT Legislative Assembly, and I was one of them for a while. We had four people in the Canberra, in the press gallery in Canberra. The Canberra Times, it ceased to exist as a newspaper there some time ago. I think it's got a couple of people back recently, but the entire gallery, for example, and it's true of the state galleries as well, has been completely gutted. All of the specialist reporters that used to be there'd be civil defence reporters, there'd be people who did foreign affairs, there'd be people who looked after particularly health. They've all gone. So everyone essentially is a generalist. I think there are two defence reporters left in the Federal Parliamentary Press Gallery. You think how much money we spend on defence and how important it's going to be. That's a very small number of people. And you do need specialist knowledge. So, this has been a time of great destruction in the media. And the most destructive thing of all, of course, has been this. Like, the world changed in 2007. We went from having the great barriers to broadcast that we always had, or to publishing, which was cost. So that when I was at the Canberra Times in the 1990s, one of the big deals was we went looking for a new press to get a colour press. They searched around the world. It cost tens of millions of dollars to build that building and put that press in, which I think came from Germany. If you wanted to broadcast satellite time internationally, extremely expensive. So only really the very rich could set these things up, or public broadcasters. But when 2007 comes along and we get the smartphone, the cost of broadcasting and publishing is cut to zero. And everyone becomes a broadcaster and a publisher. And the nature of broadcasting and publishing changes enormously and forever. And in some ways, that's a very good thing. But in other ways, what it meant for the mainstream media was that all of their advertising dollars got sucked out and now it's two or three very big players around the world. So the Facebooks and the Googles are ending up with all the advertising dollars that used to run the media in Australia, and that media used to fund journalism. So what we're getting now is a whole lot less scrutiny than we used to have, through people who are a whole lot less expert than they used to be. I think we're seeing the effects of that. We saw it first in the state political galleries, which again were completely decimated. So I think that's one of the reasons why state governments get away with a whole lot more than they used to. And now we're seeing it at a federal level. And look, some people will be dancing in the streets at this kind of destruction because they hate the mainstream media, and there are a whole lot of things that we can be accused of course, of which we are guilty. But I will say this when people talk to me about the media now. It turns out when you all became broadcasters, you're a whole lot worse than we've ever been.
Yes, that's right. That's very true. One way I sometimes think about this, as far as the print media are concerned anyway, is that it's 500 years since Gutenberg. And the change that you've alluded to with your mobile phone, it's a one in a 500-year change. I mean, this is a huge thing, seeing the erosion of print in this way, and free to air TV as well. But I guess I'd quite like to return to what I think might be connected to what you're talking about, the hollowing out of the mainstream media, which is the erosion of the old distinction between opinion and fact, or value and fact, almost. I mean, senior journalists obviously want to write op-eds, not just report facts. I mean, that's the mark of a senior journalist in many ways. Good investigative journalism, which is about speaking truth to power, right, seems hard to distinguish nowadays if you listen to some of the media, and the ABC is included in this. Hard to distinguish from promoting a worldview or promoting an agenda. And then agendas are reinforced by whatever bubble you happen to be working in. So that kind of crucial distinction between this is what happened and this is my opinion about what happened, is that being eroded as well, do you think, as part of this process of technological change in the media?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult now to separate facts from opinion. I know a really good friend of mine recently who works in the public broadcaster said that, she thought once by weight of facts that she laid up that she could make an argument about something that would convince people, and now she realises they're driven by emotion, essentially, and that's what we see in a lot of the platforms around. I mean, I think the worst of it when you're looking at the media as it now stands is Twitter, which essentially is driven by rage. It's this constant outrage machine, which again seems to be largely dominated by a pack of left-wing bullies who surround and beat to death any opinion that they don't like. And it's no different from watching playground bullies, really, but on a much larger scale. And it's kind of distressing to see how much influence it does wield, only because people in newsrooms now are responding to what they're seeing online and thinking that in some way, shape or form, it reflects public opinion, which it clearly doesn't. It just is. It's a bully's playground for a certain group, for a certain worldview. So that's the other issue that we're facing with the media. Again, we're now being influenced by what we're seeing on social media, and it's a bit like the chief medical officer and chief health officer, an editor now trying to make a decision, watches what's happening online and think, oh, well, that must be what people's interested in. I can tell you now that what happens in the ABC in the morning is that when they get together for their news conferences where everyone sits about and says, well, we know what's going on, what have we got for news today, what's running where, one of the questions that's asked very early on is what's trending online? Yeah. And that's one of the markers for what people might be doing that day. And then what's trending online? Well, let's replicate that. Let's get more of that. Let's have different angles on that story, because that's clearly what people want to read, see and hear. And there's some truth in that. And there's also, you can be completely misled by that, because what's trending sometimes is what people are making trend, or it's trivial. There's a conversation that's going on today, which is about the Prime Minister being allowed to go to Sydney and then come back to Canberra. This is an outrage, apparently. Don't forget he's been double vaccinated. Someone asked me about this morning, should it be on 6 p.m. news? And I said, isn't the Prime Minister the definition of an essential worker? We've seen plenty of people crossing borders. This is trivial politics. Let's worry about the main game. But that, of course, is online at the moment. That, of course, is drawing comment. The people who hate Scott Morrison want us to talk about that. And that's the sort of thing that I find myself resisting on almost a daily basis is, no, I don't think that's important. I think that's trivial. And yes, that is a subjective judgment, but I reckon, how the vaccination rates are going in Sydney, whether or not we're getting more vaccines, whether or not the Prime Minister is doing his job by being in Canberra is a much bigger question about, did he travel between two?
What sort of job do you think the journalism schools and the media studies departments are actually doing in terms of producing the journalists of the future? If you had to design a good training, a school for journalists, and I'm asking you this because the Ramsay Centre is in the education business more than anything else, what sort of training do you think they need? What would you look for in good, enterprising, aspiring young journalists or journalism? What are we getting wrong at that level? What should we be doing right?
Well, without meaning to be unkind, I don't know if you're getting a bit of interference. I am at the moment now, so I hope that's not coming across a bit of scratching. But in any event, without meaning to be unkind, I went into one of those degrees at the end of all that time in Sydney. I needed to get a BA after my name. I decided in order to get a job anywhere that I wanted, and there was a communications degree running what was then the Nepean College of Advanced Education before it became the University of Western Sydney, and I went into the first year of that course, and not meaning to look back in anger on it. I got the BA, but genuinely speaking, it was a far lesser quality than the seminary that I'd been in, where I'd been taught for a few years before. I would say don't study in media studies. I would do something completely different. Go and expand your mind somewhere else. And I'm not averse at all, obviously, to people getting as educated as they possibly can, as long as they can understand that people who live a different life also have worth and also have wisdom that doesn't necessarily come from the books and the disciplines that you studied. So go and learn to be a doctor. Go and learn to be a teacher. Go and learn some profession that gives you some insight into some other part of life, and to which something that you can bring to journalism, because I can teach you to be a journalist if you turn up in my organisation, if it still exists in a few years' time. You basically need to know how to read and write and listen and try to winnow out facts. You don't need to have specific training to be a journalist. Once upon a time, I remember when I first got into the newsroom at the Canberra Times, and there were the real old school people there. And one of the old editors said to me, never call journalism a profession. It's a trade. It was a trade they grew up with. They left school at the age of 16. They went on a 4 or 5 year cadetship. They went through, they worked, saw how the back of house worked. They saw how the printing presses were operated. They went and did the courts rounds. They went and did the political rounds. They did the health rounds. And then in the end, they were graded after having the experience of having all of that background in journalism. I thought that was a great way to go about training journalists. I think now, study something else, and then if you want to be a journalist, apply for a job.
Maybe a great books course in Western Civilisation might be a good training.
Great training.
Okay. So one last question. I think it's appropriate to finish with a question about younger people. It seems to me that we have a generation gap opening up that's as big as any that there's been since the 1960s. As you've said, most millennials just ignore mainstream media. I think the chances of anybody under 35 ever listening to the conversation that we're having now are pretty much nil. So how will the public discourse look when those who are now when the millennials are in control of it? Do you notice a significant difference in attitudes, for example, to COVID and to lockdowns and all these other questions between younger and older generations of journalists, of media people? I mean, the millennials and the boomer Gen X kind of generations have very different attitudes about staying at home, for example, from what I've seen and heard. Is there a different attitude that you've picked up in the newsroom, in the media community, between the under 35s and the older ones?
Oh, yes, certainly think so. And of course, for an older person can be quite irritating, because some of the ones that I meet seem to think that they should be on air as soon as they arrive. And I know that there's an attitude to sort of the hierarchy that's certainly different, and that's possibly a good thing. But one of the things that I think is a threat for the future, and hopefully this future doesn't come to pass, but there is a massive intergenerational divide that opens up for people. If the young got leadership that started to say for them, have a look at what's been wrought on our behalf, and leave aside some of the massive issues like climate change, but just the chance of ever getting a house now, because the older generation has essentially sucked up all the housing with 2 or 3 houses. That we had a disease where our education was stolen from us in order to protect people who are in their 80s and 90s, and the bill has been left for us to foot for this. That all of the benefits flowed upwards and all of the cost flowed downwards. I think that if the youth begins to find a political voice that isn't necessarily of the left or right, but one of grievance, which is that how is it that we are going to be left to pay for all the mistakes that you have made? And why should I continue to fund a health system where most of the money that we're spending now is on the last 3 years of someone's life? and the expense for me is enormous and in the end unsupportable in the community in the way in which it exists. I think that, in the future, there's quite a strong possibility that a big divide could open up between the young and the old, and the young could get quite angry. And that would be a society which would be very, very difficult to manage.
You were talking about identity politics, and I think we all used to feel that there was a kind of a thing called an Australian identity, which had a bit of a larrikin spirit, a bit of an anti-authority spirit to it, a sense of humour, and so on. Do you see that fading? Do you see that identity as persisting and into the next generation that you're talking about, or is it changing?
Look, I think it's really, really important that we have some sort of sense of an Australian identity, because we're living in a time now when we're facing an adversary which has a very clear idea of what it wants, and it's really antithetical to the way that we'd like to live our lives. And talking, of course, of China. And China wants to change the way that the world operates because it doesn't believe that it operates in its favour. Now, it has every right to think that, and as it rises as a superpower, it will assert that. We've already seen it begin to assert that, not just inside its own borders, but outside its borders and inside Australia. We've seen the 14 grievances that were delivered to Australia about what it was that Australia was doing wrong in the relationship with China, and no Australian Prime Minister could sign up to that because some of it were about the things that our parliamentarians and media were saying. It wanted us to change our nature. So we do need to understand who we are and what we are prepared to fight and die for. Unfortunately, through the course of this pandemic, I fear it's exposed a side of us that it really isn't very pleasing to look at. I think that it's exposed us as people who are remarkably risk averse, who are timid, and who don't really have a clear sense of an Australian identity at all. We've seen ourselves split into states and split into suburbs now. We're quite happy to have neighbour against neighbour. This is not a society that can stand on 2 feet and fight for ideals and ideas that it believes in. So I think that we need to have a conversation about this. I think that it's always struck me that we probably did have an overblown sense of our sort of rugged individualism. We're the most urbanised society on earth, essentially, and we have been for a very, very long time. I think that the tone that struck at the foundation of these societies rings through them a long time. And if you look at what happened in the United States, there was a group of people, the Pilgrims, who were fleeing the establishment to set up a colony somewhere in the world where they weren't ruled by a state religion. And so forever in the United States, they've always said that the people are suspicious of the government. Well, if you look at the founding of Australia, the government brought everyone here. And on the day of 1788, when the jailers arrived, they came with the jailed, and then there were the dispossessed. They were the three groups of Australians that existed then. And ever since then, at least one group has thought, the big Australian question is, what's the government doing about this? And one of the things I've always thought about government in Australia is that government is suspicious of the people because they're either criminals or they're Indigenous, and they don't trust either. And that's why they don't share information. So I think we do need a better idea of what an Australian identity is. I don't know exactly what that is, but I think there should be some starting points that we can all agree on and argue about everything else, which is a parliamentary democracy, the rule of law, freedom of expression, movement and association. Surely these are things that we can all agree on, and we should recognise we've taken some of those things away during this pandemic, and they'll be hard to get back.
Chris Uhlmann, thank you so much for talking to us. It's been fascinating. We could easily go on for longer, but I must unfortunately draw this to a close. Great pleasure talking to you, and thank you very much for speaking to us, Chris Uhlmann.
Thank you, Simon.